why are we having a conversation about science, scientism, materialism more generally on a podcast that's supposedly about politics? And the reason is that science is a one method that we have of making sense of the world, and it, at least for a long time, has been the most powerful one we could find. And so it has bearing on our political communities. It has bearing on our epistemological coherence. That we understand science properly, and that those who are entrusted to communicate science to the public are doing so faithfully, and are also not being corrupted by different ideological worldviews, whether those are political or otherwise. So, with all of that being said, I think we've set the stage properly then to get into the main topic today, which is this scientist, molecular biologist, and that is Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert Sheldrake is a biochemist with an interest in plant physiology. He holds degrees in natural sciences, a master's in natural science from Clare College, Cambridge. He was also a Frank Knox Fellow in Philosophy and the History of Science at Harvard, as well as a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Cambridge. And that's just a little bit of his credentials there, so that people know that this guy that we're talking about is not some quack who's conducting experiments in his garage. Although I would say that from a pure scientific perspective, we wouldn't necessarily be opposed to that either, as long as it was sound and replicable. But this is a serious scientist who has some serious credentials. And of course, I already mentioned earlier in this conversation that the crank slur always gets thrown around when these elder scientists start throwing their weight around and decide that they finally have enough clout to start speaking freely. He has certainly been demonized himself as a crank. And if you go to his Wikipedia page, they will give you a not so flattering summary from the beginning. They don't even introduce him as a scientist. I think they introduce him as like an author and a conspiracy theorist or something or other like that. But you have known about Rupert Sheldrake a little bit longer than I have. I only recently discovered his work and his ideas several months ago, and I will talk a little bit about that in a moment. But do you want to just give a brief introduction of your view of Rupert Sheldrake and how you came to discover him?
Yeah, sure. To me, Sheldrake's kind of an interesting figure. Um, my interest in Sheldrake comes from kind of this side interest I have in scientific renegades. So, like, for example, um, kind of one of my scientific heroes is Freeman Dyson. And one of the reasons I love Freeman Dyson so much is because he was just one of these people who would just be like, say the most outlandish stuff, just so that he could push the envelope a little bit more. And in a sense, I think science needs people like that. Every once in a while, we have to let, and I'll use this term, we have to let the cranks in. We have to let them just say what they say and push it to the limit, so that we can figure out, where they're wrong or where they might be right. I'll give you a great example. B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was kind of the father, or rather the torchbearer for this idea in psychology called
Mm-hmm.
behaviorism. Behaviorism was this idea that in order to understand psychology, in order to understand the human mind, all you have to understand is behavior as a system of inputs to a system and then outputs. So, why are we influenced by things in our environment and what does it cause? And Skinner at the time was saying, I don't have to understand anything about the mind to understand behavior. What's really interesting is that during a dinner conversation, a philosopher went up to not Rupert Sheldrake, to B.F. Skinner, and he said, "Hey, Skinner, you really think you can explain everything with behaviorism?" And Skinner was like, "Yeah, of course." And the philosopher said, "Okay, explain this to me." And he just said some nonsense sentence to him. He said something like, "There's not a black scorpion falling upon this table." That was the sentence. And B.F. Skinner, that basically sent him into an existential crisis. And for like the next 20 years, he spent a book trying to answer this guy's one question. And in the book, he basically says, I can define language in terms of the behavioral process. And his answer comes like towards the end of the book, he says, well, the scorpion represented behaviorism, and you're dropping it on the table. But the whole point is that the book was absurd. B.F. Skinner kind of really pushed the boundaries in terms of how far he could take behaviorism. And one of the people who critiqued it was a fellow named Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky said, hey, no, I'm going to write this book review and say this is why we have to understand some of the inner machinations of the mind. And really, that book review is one of the things that kicked off the cognitive revolution and us understanding cognition. And in a sense, if you were to sit there and look at B.F. Skinner, you would say, this guy needs to shut up. This is nonsense. Stop, stop, stop. His absurd ideas actually led to progress in science. And by shutting him out, we would have just been completely, stuck on the behaviorist path, I think, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, so behaviorism actually was quite dominant for a period of time and sort of became its own dogmatism itself. And I would agree with you there that there's sort of a digestive process that takes place where you kind of have to move through these ideas as phases to sort of come out the other end, and everybody kind of needs to sort through them themselves, have those debates, have those conversations, and eventually kind of move into the next paradigm, right? The next paradigm of thinking.